Imagine waking up in a world where half the people you know will be dead by winter. Not from war, but from an invisible phantom. The year is 541 AD, and the apocalypse has just washed ashore. When we think of the Great Plague, our minds almost immediately jump to the 1300s, to medieval plague doctors and crowded cobblestone streets. But the first true global pandemic, a nightmare that wiped out nearly 50% of Europe's population, actually struck 8 centuries earlier in 541 AD. This was the Plague of Justinian, a terrifying strain of Yersinia pestis that eventually crept its way into the misty, fractured lands of 6th century Britain. To understand how the people of early England faced this apocalypse, you first have to understand the gritty, exhausting reality of their daily lives. This wasn't an era of shining armor or towering stone castles. The Romans had abandoned the island over a century prior, leaving their grand bathhouses, paved roads, and complex aqueducts to crumble into overgrown ruins. The people left behind, a mix of native Britons and arriving Anglo-Saxon settlers, lived in a world that had physically and technologically regressed. They spent their days entirely off the grid in small, isolated farming settlements, residing in timber-framed halls with thatched roofs and sunken floors. Life was a relentless, punishing cycle of manual labor. From sunrise to sunset, families worked the earth just to secure enough barley, wheat, and root vegetables to survive the brutal, unforgiving winters. There was no leisure time. You were either planting, harvesting, weaving coarse wool for clothing, or constantly repairing your shelter. Hygiene, by our modern standards, was a completely alien concept. The sophisticated plumbing of the Roman era was a forgotten magic. Instead, families washed in freezing streams or wooden tubs, occasionally using harsh, primitive mixtures of animal fat and wood ash to scrub away the daily grime. But the real danger wasn't necessarily the dirt, it was their proximity to nature. To conserve heat during the biting cold months, families shared their single-room, smoke-filled homes with their livestock. Pigs, sheep, and dogs slept just feet away from the central hearth. The dirt floors were insulated with layers of rushes and straw, which absorbed animal waste and dropped food, creating an absolute paradise for vermin. Black rats, which had stowed away on merchant ships trading tin and wine from the Mediterranean, scurried freely through the thatch above their heads. And where there were rats, there were fleas. Flea bites were so incredibly common that no one paid them any mind. They were just an itchy, accepted nuisance of daily existence. No one could have possibly suspected that these tiny insects, gorging on the blood of infected ship rodents, were carrying a bacterial atomic bomb. When the sickness finally hit the shores of Britain, it moved like a ghost. The people had no concept of germ theory, no understanding of microscopic pathogens. They only knew that suddenly their neighbors were collapsing with raging fevers. The onset of the disease was vicious and horrifyingly swift, striking with a brutality that defied any known medical logic of the 6th century. It began with a sudden, bone-chilling fever, followed rapidly by agonizing headaches and a terrifying, overwhelming fatigue. Within days, the true hallmark of the apocalypse appeared. Grotesque, blackish swellings known as buboes erupted in the groin, armpits, and neck. These swollen lymph nodes were excruciatingly painful, often weeping blood and pus. Victims fell into delirious states, tormented by violent hallucinations before their bodies finally gave out. Families watched helplessly as the strongest, youngest laborers in their villages withered into corpses within the span of a single week. There were no hospitals, no antibiotics, and absolutely no understanding of how the infection spread. The Learned physicians of the old Roman era were long gone, replaced by village healers who relied on a mix of passed-down folklore, herbal leechcraft, and desperate superstition. They applied foul-smelling poultices made of crushed garlic, onions, and rancid butter to the blistering sores, desperately hoping to draw out the mysterious poison. Some turned to bloodletting, a misguided attempt to balance the body's humours, which only succeeded in weakening the patient further. As the death toll skyrocketed, a profound psychological terror gripped the surviving population, the relentless daily routine of farming and weaving ground to a sudden, catastrophic halt. Crops were left to rot in the muddy fields, and livestock wandered aimlessly into the forests, unfed and unmilked, because there was simply no one left healthy enough to tend to them. In their absolute desperation, people turned their faces to the heavens, though they were deeply divided on who to pray to. The native Britons largely clung to their early Christian faith, organizing desperate fasting and continuous prayer vigils, viewing the plague as the wrath of a furious god punishing them for their earthly sins. Meanwhile, the Anglo-Saxon settlers often reverted to their pagan roots, offering urgent animal sacrifices to Woden and Thuna in the darkened woods, hoping to appease the ancient spirits. They wore crude amulets of bone, iron, and bronze, desperately clutching at any sliver of protection against the invisible miasma they believed was blowing through the wind. Survival quickly became a matter of brutal isolation. Trade routes that carried essential goods were entirely abandoned. Travelers or merchants who dared to approach a settlement were treated with intense hostility, chased away from village borders by desperate, armed men who feared that outsiders carried the curse in their breath. Trust evaporated completely. Neighbours stopped checking on neighbours. The bustling, noisy mead halls, once the warm, beating heart of community life, fell entirely silent. The sheer volume of the dead quickly overwhelmed their traditional burial customs, forcing survivors to hastily pile bodies into mass trenches just to get the rotting flesh away from the living. Ultimately, the nightmare didn't end with a miraculous cure or a sudden medical breakthrough. The pathogen simply burned itself out. The plague of Justinian slowly receded from the British Isles because it literally ran out of human hosts to infect. For those who somehow made it to the other side of the apocalypse, survival was rarely a testament to their herbal remedies or frantic prayers. It was almost entirely a matter of blind, geographical luck and natural, genetic resilience. If your settlement was situated deep enough in the dense, untamed woodlands, completely cut off from the coastal trading ports and the crumbling Roman roads, you had a fighting chance. When the survivors finally emerged from their terrified, self-imposed isolation to survey the damage, they stepped into an eerily quiet, profoundly altered world. Entire farming hamlets had been wiped completely off the map, leaving behind nothing but empty timber halls decaying in the damp British weather. The psychological toll was unfathomable. Every single survivor carried the heavy, unspoken trauma of losing parents, children, and lifelong friends within a matter of days. Yet, there was no luxury of time to sit and mourn. The brutal necessity of survival forced them to push through their immense grief. Nature, meanwhile, wasted absolutely no time reclaiming the land. Fields that had taken generations of back-breaking labor to clear were swiftly swallowed by creeping briars, thick thistles, and sprawling forests. Wildlife rebounded fiercely. Wolf packs previously hunted to the fringes of the island grew bold and multiplied, freely roaming through the overgrown, silent valleys. However, this catastrophic depopulation triggered a massive, unexpected shift in the social fabric of early England. With half the workforce buried in mass graves, human labor suddenly became the rarest and most valuable resource on the island. The surviving farmers, who had previously been bound to local chieftains by strict obligations and heavy agricultural tributes, found themselves holding unprecedented leverage. There was abundant, fertile land ripe for the taking, and practically no one left to enforce the old social hierarchies. Families simply packed their meager belongings, walked away from the plague-tainted settlements, and claimed expansive tracts of abandoned farmland for themselves. The elite warrior classes and regional warlords lost a staggering amount of their wealth and power because their entire tax base had literally vanished into the earth. This apocalyptic reset fundamentally reshaped the future of the nation. It severely weakened the remaining native Briton kingdoms, clearing the path for the Anglo-Saxon culture to firmly dominate the social vacuum. The survivors of 541 AD didn't just endure the end of their world. They inadvertently became the gritty, resilient architects of a completely new era. They adapted to the vast emptiness by forming tighter, aggressively self-sufficient communities, leaving the last lingering ghosts of antiquity behind to forge the localized agrarian society that would eventually evolve into medieval England. They had stared directly into the face of a microscopic apocalypse and stubbornly rebuilt their lives from the muddy ground up.